Flight Risk, the new action thriller directed by Mel Gibson, is in theaters now, and really the burning question surrounding this movie was whether it would be yet another generic action flick dumped into the dog days of the movie release calendar, or if the intriguing creative talent, both in front and behind the camera, would just be able to elevate this film to greater heights. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I will cut right to the chase with this. This movie is like high concept gimmick of like an action thriller set almost like exclusively within the very claustrophobic confines of like an airborne airplane is a really fascinating idea. I am typically like the target audience for these type of like contained thrillers. Unfortunately, I think it's very like uninspired script just results in like a mostly turbulent ride. I think with poor direction, unlikable characters, and just a total lack of sustained suspense, Flight Risk fails to squeeze really much entertainment value from its very promising concept. The story itself follows an air marshal who is played by actress Michelle Dockery of Downton Abbey fame, who is tasked with transporting a crucial witness for a trial. Yet, while aboard a small local aircraft, she realizes that the pilot, who is played by Mark Wahlberg, is in fact a hitman paid to kill them. So on the surface, I think Flight Risk just has all the makings of a very edge-of-your-seat type of thriller, but perhaps surprisingly, I think director Mel Gibson, who, like personal life controversies aside, is, I think, an indisputably skilled storyteller, becomes the liability. Where the cramped confines of like the airplane obviously place very strict limitations on, the film's action, and Gibson just struggles to work within those parameters. The film fails to like build or maintain tension when the characters aren't engaged in like an actual physical conflict, kind of rather than a slow burn of escalating tension, the sort of like ticking time bomb story that just feels headed towards a very explosive conclusion. Flight Risk is a mostly uninspired character drama with only like brief bursts of action that quickly become repetitive. The film also just lacks a clear identity or sense of purpose. It almost feels as though like the filmmakers just couldn't decide whether to make like a throwback 1990s pulp action flick or like a more sophisticated thriller. And I think like as a result, it just lands in that very unsatisfying middle ground between those two very different tonal identities, never getting like wild enough to work as just simple, dumb fun, but also featuring characters and dialogue that are just a bit too goofy to ever be taken very seriously. Actor Mark Wahlberg has been on a very like interesting career path in recent years, particularly when it comes to like faith-based stories, but he just isn't given much to work with here. In fact, his character spends most of this film's runtime handcuffed and incapacitated, left to sit in the back of the plane spouting profanities, really more of like an annoyance than being a looming, like ever-present threat. And even just like the ease with which he's repeatedly foiled and recaptured also just diminishes his menace, despite the almost like comical amount of just like close-up shots of his snarling and deranged face. And to make matters even worse, kind of like the novice flying an airplane that's running out of fuel element of this story is just equally as uncompelling. Really, other than one very brief instance where the plane has a close shave with a mountainside, there's just little like heightened drama or complications before the aircraft's like eventual landing. And the film attempts to like fill these lulls in the action with a contrived subplot involving some corrupt figure within the marshal's office, but most of that storyline develops like off-screen just through phone calls with faceless characters, which just strips like the drama of any real punch. And I think even more importantly, the film just never communicates like how this off-screen action impacts like the primary story. Obviously, like having a corrupt colleague, has long-term career implications for the air marshal, but it just doesn't have much bearing on like her immediate dilemma. As far as content I consider, things going on the surface of this, there is a fair amount of here to be aware of. For language, there is a heavy amount of profanity really all throughout, including just frequent F-bombs and an array of other curse words and just some very like vulgar and like sexually charged speech. As far as violence, there is some action sequences where characters are punched and stabbed and choked and shocked with a taser, although like minimal blood is shown. There's also a moment where a character is run over by a truck and you see like his body visible being hit and like run over by the tires, but the scene itself is quite brief and it's not depicted in a very like gratuitously violent way. For sexuality, there's plenty of crude and like sexual language. One man repeatedly makes very vulgar like sexual advances towards another man, very clearly implying his intention to rape him, although whether like the man initiating is sincere or just merely trying to like unsettle the other man is not made entirely clear. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I think despite featuring some creative talent in Mel Gibson and Mark Wahlberg, who have both dipped their toes in some notable faith-based storytelling, there just aren't that many redemptive themes for Christian audiences to embrace in this movie, beyond just sort of some general motifs of perseverance and finding the courage to overcome extreme circumstances. Although perhaps one relatively more focused thematic through line is the idea that outward appearances are deceiving and that actions are what truly define a person. I think on a superficial level, that theme is showcased through, Mark Wahlberg's character being something, far different than the way that he presents himself to be. But in a more meaningful way, the other two characters also demonstrate that same principle. The witness who begins this film in handcuffs may not be as bad as he first appears, and also the air marshal who is transporting him has her own dark secrets and past traumas. And Wahlberg's character repeatedly taunts the marshal with sort of the classic mustache twirling motif of "we're not so different, you and I." But over the course of this film, the marshal does come to accept that her identity is not defined just by her past, but by her future choices. But this film clearly aims to entertain rather than to explore deep themes. There's just not a whole lot of intellectual meat on the bone, but I do think audiences can affirm that good ultimately wins out in the end, and the characters who rise to the occasion to just demonstrate heroism in the face of extreme trials. So in the end, as a simple action thriller with a mid-January release, audiences perhaps shouldn't expect anything too groundbreaking, but Flight Risk falls short, I think, even of those modest expectations. I just kept waiting for a payoff at the end of this very meandering cinematic flight, whether that's a shocking plot twist at the end that would dramatically recontextualize the story, or at least some explosive third act action that would just ramp up the stakes and excitement, only for this film to conclude really very abruptly and anticlimactically, having just never reached that higher level. But hey, I would love to hear what you guys think. If you check this out, if you have a more positive experience with the film, don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so, encourage you guys, become a collider, subscribe to the channel, got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide through World for Christ.